Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Sasha Loewen, and I am recording a lecture for the Natural Systems Agriculture class as a guest lecturer for Martin Entz. Today's lecture will be on precision agroecology. Um, and so we will be discussing the concept of precision agriculture, which is largely a collection of tools, sensors, and modern digital equipment, and GPS, and so on, and how that allows a farmer to farm on a smaller scale and think about their agriculture on a smaller scale using modern tech. And agroecology, which is essentially a way of, excuse me, farming with nature rather than against nature. And and that idea of uniting those two is a very much a way of looking into the future of what agriculture might be. And so that's why I've included this picture as the title slide for the talk today, as we have an imagination of what farming might look like in the year 2000 from the year 1899. And you can see that the farmer is using this advanced electrical technology, and he's sitting off of the field. And so that's sort of what we're going to be doing today, is looking forward into the future and trying to imagine what the future of agriculture might look like, and whether it might be precision agroecology. So, just a quick outline of what we're going to talk about today. So this is, of course, a recorded lecture, different from the in-class lecture, which would be slightly different. But I'll be going over my own personal background just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, what my past research experience has been. We'll discuss agroecology as a concept, introduce it. We'll discuss precision agriculture as a concept, where it's at right now. And then get into this idea of whether the two are capable of merging, and whether we can use precision agriculture in an agroecological setting. Then I'll talk a little bit about my own research, some of my PhD research, and some of the things I'm working on now, and how that pertains to precision agroecology. And then discuss some other ideas from other researchers, just briefly touching on some of the other concepts that surround this idea. And then yeah, we'll conclude, and it should be great. Okay, so just a quick background on myself. So again, my name is Sasha Loewen. I grew up on a organic grain farm in southeast Manitoba, where I actually still farm with my dad there today. I did my PhD on the other side of the prairies in Montana State University, where, again, I thought about this idea of precision agroecology. So our whole lab was very much an agroecology lab, but we all used precision ag technology in the work that we did. Out there, I worked on a number of Montana organic grain farmers' farms, including the Bob Quinn farm. And I'd just like to point out how different the terrain there looks compared to the Red River Valley, where here it's very sandy and stony and hilly, and here, of course, in the Red River Valley, it's very flat and clay soils typically. Anyway, since finishing my PhD a couple of years ago, I moved back to the University of Manitoba, where I've been working as a research associate in Dr. Martin Entz's lab, the Natural Systems Agriculture Lab. And one of my project is looking at precision control of Canadian thistle, particularly on organic grain farmers' fields. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these things that I've been up to in the last few years. So start with agroecology. So what is the definition of agroecology? Um, Defining agroecology can be somewhat tricky, since there are often different competing parties that use use agroecology in different senses. So I'm not sure if this is blocking here, but agroecology is a science. It's also a movement, and it's also a practice. So depending on who you are, if you're a scientist, you might be studying ecology within agricultural systems. In Latin America in particular, agroecology is often seen as a movement of peasant farmers who are sort of reimagining rural societies. And then, of course, it's also seen as a practice. So if you ask a farmer um, what agroecology is, they might say it is farming with nature. Um, and so we see those things here. So agroecology can be a scientific discipline where it's often within the ecological realm. So an ecologist might study agricultural plants. It can also be a movement, like I was saying, more of a imagining of rural societies, and then a practice, which are the techniques that agroecology might enable, which typically think about how to use or how to work with nature rather than against it. And then there are Gleasman's five levels of agroecology, which again, now if we're thinking about putting this more into the practice side of things, there are at the very first level, it's reducing input. So if you think about conventional farming, reducing the amount of synthetic nitrogen, for example. The next level up is substituting sustainable inputs. So if again, if we're thinking about starting with conventional agriculture, instead of applying synthetic nitrogen, a farmer could plant a green manure cover crop as their fertility source. That would be substituting sustainable inputs. And then level three, incorporating beneficial biodiversity. So thinking about incorporating more and more biodiversity onto the farm. This could be through, of course, just planting more crops, planting intercropping, planting cover crops, or even thinking about, um, we'll talk a little bit about later, precision conservation, this idea of removing low-performing areas of a field from production and allowing that space to simply be a natural system, whether it's a restored natural system or even simply just left to its own devices, that can often be seen as a way of incorporating more biodiversity. Those are the three levels that we'll talk a little bit more about today. The other two levels, of course, are higher level thinking about supply chains and from a global scale. But we'll stay a little bit closer to the field scale today. Okay, so that was a real quick introduction of agroecology. Now, quick introduction of precision agriculture. So thinking about a quick definition of precision agriculture, we might often think of narrowing the, excuse me, narrowing the scope of or narrowing the scale upon which agriculture is practiced. So um, typically on large scale farming, particularly in North America, an input, whether it's seed or fertilizer or chemical, is applied across a field at one single rate. Now, that might be from that rate can be informed from field scouting and from soil sampling and from farmer know-how and so on. But generally, it's simply one rate spread across the entire field. Precision agriculture allows a farmer to break the field into different chunks and apply only the amount of input in those spaces that's actually required. And so, in one sense, then we are uh, farming farming by the variation that's actually present in the field, um, and um, and we're able to reduce our inputs. And so in some ways, precision agriculture, or many ways, really, it can be seen as more sustainable. Yeah, the very simplest definition in my mind is managing by variation. So if you know what variation is present across a field, and you're able to apply your inputs accordingly, you can farm much more efficiently. The key technologies driving precision agriculture, you need to be able to track your location digitally, so through something like GPS. You need to be able to uncover the field variation. So a farmer might have a sense of, okay, there's hilltops and so on, but there's many other types of variation that can be incorporated digitally. This can come from satellite data. Very often we think about getting it from yield maps, so knowing where a field typically yields high, where it typically yields low. Again, farmer knowledge. And then you can take all of that variation information and apply variable rates based on this variability map. Um, and so that's just a sense of what precision agriculture is. Okay, so now thinking forward so I've introduced agroecology, I've introduced precision agriculture. Are those two able to go together? So I'm going to go now into kind of a deep dive into a historical look at where these two competing paradigms actually might be coming from. So um, precision agriculture and agroecology don't necessarily go hand in hand. Um, so this is just an idea of a historical trajectory of production-oriented system that we're looking at. So, of course, in the 1850s, we start identifying this idea of high input agriculture, adding nitrogen to fields to restore their fertility. 1960s, we get the Green Revolution, where we increase crop productivity through crop breeding and higher inputs again. Then more recently, we have the second wave of the Green Revolution, sometimes it's called, in which we are using genetically modified organisms to increase production. All of these ideas along the top line here are about production-oriented systems. And we can think of precision agriculture very much falling within the production-oriented paradigm of agriculture. Along the bottom line here, we have a different concept of agriculture in which we have conservation agriculture coming sort of as a response to the Green Revolution. So thinking about returning diversity to the land, reducing tillage, and so on. Nowadays we have organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture that are both very popular methods of farming, and these are the ecologically oriented farming types I'm saying. And of course, agroecology would fit into the ecologically oriented method of agriculture. And I'm sort of taking a step back here to introduce these just to say that we have precision agriculture, which fits into production oriented, agroecology, which fits into ecologically oriented, and and it can be somewhat of a leap then to imagine, are we able to combine the two to actually use precision technology rather in agroecology um, as they've sort of been um, in competing paradigms. And so in some ways it's imagining a new paradigm where we combine both of those technologies together. And so it's a merger of those two movements. Um, and that's what we're exploring here. Okay. Um, right. Precision agroecology, production versus ecologically oriented, and precision agroecology is combining the two. So um, uh, that's a big part of the introduction. And now I want to get a little bit more into applied precision agroecology. So we talked about precision agriculture, applying specific input rates at certain levels. But the key agronomic question with precision agroecology, or with precision ag in general, is how do we know what rate to put where? There are two competing ideas within precision agroecology. One is the so-called Robin Hood treatment. So this is the understanding that on poor performing areas of the field, we should increase rates, whatever our input is, to restore those areas to full system health. So you can imagine a scenario where you see underperforming areas of your field and you say, that must be limited by fertility, so we're going to increase our rates in those spaces. The flip side of that idea is the King's treatment, which is the exact opposite of Robin Hood, in which the poor performing areas of the field are a waste of inputs. And so rather than investing your resources in those spaces, invest your increased resources in the high performing areas of your field. So in that sense, you can take whatever input you're placing across your field and increase it in the high performing areas of the field. And of course, it can be challenging to know which is which, and there's actually been considerable debate about this. Um, and um, and when it really comes down to it, of course, the answer is it depends which is correct. And you can imagine certain inputs which would fit into one category and certain inputs which fit into the other category. So, as we discussed in class, a Robin Hood treatment might be a pesticide, for example. So, if you have an area affected by pests, that area should get a higher treatment. And so the poor area gets an increased rate. I've also talked to farmers who might see that same situation using a manure treatment, where the manure is actually able to increase the productivity of the soil in a space. On the flip side of King's treatment, seed is a classic example of King's treatment. So um, if you have high performing areas of the field, typically they have higher nutrients, they probably have more water, they maybe have better soil. In those spaces, they can often support a higher density of plant life. And so you can increase your seeding rates there. And then say a dry hilltop, a dry rocky hilltop on your field, it doesn't matter if you add more seed to that space, you're not going to increase productivity because it simply can't support more plant life. And so, of course, with different inputs, you'll have different paradigms for this. But even within a field, there's still quite a bit of lack of understanding on which of these treatments works where and how well it works. And so, one of the crucial breakthroughs, I think, that precision agriculture has allowed for is actually testing what rates work where. And so this is an idea of precision experimentation across this field to determine what optimal rates are. And so the solution to this problem then is on-farm precision experimentation, which we'll talk a little bit about now. Yeah, so um, on-farm precision experimentation is this idea of experimenting with input rates across a field so you actually know what rate works where. And so I'm just going to show you an example of an organic on-farm precision experimentation rotation where we vary input rates across the entire field. So I've got this complicated diagram up here, but starting here with with experimentation. So we vary seeding rates across an entire field. And in here, we're actually looking, just to add a little bit of complexity, we're actually looking at a 2-year rotation. So year one, we are varying seeding rates of a green manure cover crop. So pea, for example. The farmer then tills them in. The next year, they vary seeding rates randomly, again, across their entire field. In this case, a cash crop of barley. The crop comes up, the combine harvester collects the yield. Crucially, we're able to collect a yield map from the combine, run that through an economic function, which allows us to get a net return for the entire field. And you can see we already see considerable variability across the field, which actually has nothing to do with the input seeding rates, but it's simply natural variability that is existing across the field. And then we can add a bunch of other variables that help us explain variability across the field. So that can be satellite indices like a vegetation index. It can be topographic variables like elevation, and can include even manually sampled variables. So, for example, across this field, I collected weed biomass mid-growing season, and so that's another variable that we're able to include in this model. We can then put all of that information into a algorithm, which tells us um, if we look here at this simplified figure, that as our seeding rate increases across a space, our net return increases. You can see that seeding rate goes up, net return goes up. We hit a peak, and that peak then is our economically optimum seeding rate for the field. And of course, any seed rate above that is leading to a decline in net return as those seed resources are wasted. So based on this entire experiment, data collection, and modeling process, we can then come up with a new optimized seeding rate for both years of the rotation for this farm. And so this is an example of what that looks like. And this is an example, of course, of how we can use precision agriculture in agroecological farming. Okay, so many inputs can go into this model, including machine variables like yield and the seeding rate, of course, which come off of a farmer's equipment. Satellite variables like NDVI, which is essentially a measure of greenness of a field, which tells us how healthy a plant might be. Other satellite soil variables, which are very coarse textured, as they're just estimates, but they still give us a sense of field variability. Topographic variables, again, like elevation, which is often very crucial for determining where resources are allocated, and then manually collected um, um, variability. So, anyway, so just to say that all of these are variables that can go into our model to help us understand field variability. And it's very exciting at this time because with modern technology and with remote sensing and so on, the number of variables that we can use to examine a field is increasing all the time. So this is just a more detailed way of looking at what we were just looking at, which is we collect the data, run a model, and then predict optimum input rates across each point on the field. And I think the main takeaway from this slide is simply that if we look at two different points on a field, we'll get two different um, 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 responses to seeding rates. So you can see on this yellow arrow here, as the seed rate increases, we have um, a different looking um, a different model for the yellow arrow as we do when we go to the pink arrow. They're similar, but each one will have a different optimum seeding rate because they have, of course, different physical characteristics. Okay. Um, so yeah, back to that original question then, is it a Robin Hood question treatment or a King's treatment? It's going to depend. Every point on the field will have a different response to a different variable. So I won't get into all these graphs, but it's just to say that seeding rate will have a different effect on yield in different places on the field. Okay. Um, I want to just go over one example then. So I showed the methodology of this on-farm precision experimentation on organic farms. Now I just want to show you a specific example from across a single field. So just to remind you what we're looking at, we have our actual experimental rate, which are randomly varied rates across the entire field. We have and so that is what we put out as an experiment on the field. Based on that information, we're able to do the modeling exercise like I just described and come up with new optimum seeding rates for the field, which we can simulate and compare to this experiment, but we can also compare them to what the farmer would have done. So we're looking at the actual experimental rate, which we put across the field randomly. We can compare that then to the farmer chosen rate, which is what the farmer would have done on a normal year without considering any of this experimentation or precision agriculture at all. We can compare that to a new optimum uniform rate. So based on this whole modeling exercise, based on this whole experiment, we can come up with a new uniform rate across the field that um, that is an optimum for the whole field, but does not necessarily deploy variable rate technology. So it does not necessarily vary or it does not vary across the field. And then finally, our optimized, a final optimized simulated output is the optimum variable rate. So this is now imagining we've done the experiment. And we simulate what the optimum seed rate would be in each cell of the field. And we allow that rate to be placed there. And then we can compare the net returns of each of these strategies. And so you can see so we then run the simulation and we compare the actual experiment, which is our purple bar here, as a net return function and how it compares to the farmer chosen rate. So that is if the farmer had done nothing at all, if they just done what they normally do. And that's the red dashed line here. So that's our baseline. So the actual experiment, the purple bar, falls below the farmer chosen rate, telling us that these completely random seeding rates across a field actually cost the farmer some money. So that is that is far from optimal. Now, if they put in the optimum uniform rate across their field, the new rate that they discovered from the experiment, they're able to make more money. And then finally, um, um, the optimum variable rate um, strategy is the third bar here, and you can see it performs the best relative to all three strategies and the farmer chosen rate. And so that's not terribly surprising. This is just an example um, of what the net return output looks like when we do this modeling exercise. And we like to show it like this in the sense that we're looking at net return and we're looking at it relative to the different strategies in the field, which gives the farmer the ability then to understand for themselves what gains they might receive if they apply um, the variable rate technology across the field. Okay, so here again, here's the example that I was promising to talk about. So here's an actual example from a field in southeast Manitoba where there's a spring wheat crop planted in 2019. So again, we start with the actual experimental rates. These are rates randomized across the entire field. And you can see this is the actual yield that we got on this field. So about 3 tons per hectare with a net return there as well. Then we move forward to the farmer chosen rate, which is just about 180 kilograms per hectare, which is what the farmer would have normally chosen to done aside from an experiment. Then we go to a new optimum uniform rate, which is actually lower than that. So the uniform rate predicted by the experiment is lower than what the farmer would have done. And you can see that the yield in the optimum uniform rate doesn't change from the farmer chosen rate. It stays at 3.05 tons per hectare, but the net return goes up because the farmer is actually saving money on what would otherwise be essentially wasted seed. And then in our optimum variable rate scenario, where the seed is allowed to be optimized within every cell across the field, You can see that we have a wide degree of variability across the field, where in some places on the field we have very low rates. Other places where perhaps there's more water or nutrients, we have very high rates. And there you can see our yield goes up to 3.16 tons per hectare, and our net return rises considerably as well. And when we compare all four of those strategies to each other, you can see that, again, our farmer baseline here is the zero. The experiment was actually relatively costly to the farmers in that it cost them $20 per hectare. But that the other two strategies, when we put in the optimized rates, rise considerably, all the way up to about $60 a hectare for the new optimized variable rate treatment. So that is to say, um, running the experiment cost the farmer some money, but that information now is worth to them as much as $60 per hectare because they now know what rate might be optimized in that space, given similar climatic conditions. Okay, I'm going to skip the 2-year rotation in sake of time, and just highlight the main results of organic on-farm precision experimentation, which is that again, this is from, sorry, I should have said that we did this experiment across 11 different environments in Montana and Manitoba during my PhD. The average experiment cost about $7 per hectare. Um, the average information, the average optimum rate increase um, in net return that the farmer receives by putting in the new optimized rate is $29 per hectare. And then finally, the optimum variable rate allows the farmer to make, on average, $50 per hectare more if they're able to apply the optimized variable rate. And there's a few individual information there that I won't go into at this time. So key findings on farm precision experimentation. It allowed for spatial optimization of seeding rates across fields. The experiments themselves have a cost, and that this can be done with both cash crops and green manure cover crops for farmers. The next step beyond this is to note that farmers have other goals beside net return. And so farmers can actually do this as well using or thinking about optimizing their seeding rates for minimizing weeds, which is another whole chapter of my dissertation. Or any other goals that they might have. So, of course, yield and net return are the main ones that we think about as farmer goals, but minimizing weeds could be one. You could even think about long-term experiments where a farmer wants to increase soil organic matter and how they could adjust their rates accordingly. Or increasing biodiversity. So that is just to say that there are many other goals that a farmer might have than simple net return. Okay, so like I said, I did do another whole experiment looking at, rather than optimizing for net return, can you optimizing for weed minimization? And I'm not going to show all the results from that. Just to say that we did the same setup of experiments, and I will highlight two figures here. So this is again a 2-year rotation where we're looking at seeding rates. These are the optimum variable seeding rates across the field for maximizing net return. If we run those same seeding rates to minimize for wheat biomass, you see a very different seeding rate uh, prescription show up. And so just to say that we can run these same experiments for a different output rate or for a different outcome, and that our seeding rates are adjusted accordingly. And I should also say that the results of our experiment showed that seeding rates had a relatively small effect, but they did have a real effect. And so organic farmers looking to minimize weeds using precision ag tech, that might be a hopeful solution, or at least another tool in the toolbox of an organic farmer to reduce to reduce weed pressures on their field. So I'm not going to go into all of these details of the weed results, but just to say that that there was some success. Okay, so to conclude on this idea of on-farm precision experimentation on organic farms, um, we know about field variation from many different sources, but by being able to experiment on the field, we can determine what optimum input rates are in those spaces. So simulations from these experiments reveal optimal input rates, and optima can be determined for different goals, whether that's yield, net return, or weed competition, or anything else that can be measured. And then just um, another quick shift to discuss how I'm using this in my current research. So as I mentioned in the weed research, I went out and manually sampled weed biomass on all of the fields that we were working on. That's of course very labor intensive, and drones are starting to become better and better at weed mapping. And so what I'm currently working on in my research is using drone generated images of fields to plot out where Canadian thistles are growing on a field, and then hopefully taking that forward to the next step and seeing whether we can control um, some of the Canadian thistle across fields using seeding rates. And we're starting with Canadian thistle as that's a very problematic weed in organic systems. It also so it's very problematic, but it also actually lends itself to tracking since it is a perennial weed and it grows strongly in patches, which actually make it somewhat easier to map than some other weeds. Um, yeah, so I'm not going to go into all the background here of Canadian thistle. But obviously, it is a very problematic weed in organic systems. Organic farmers typically control that using tillage or alfalfa. Um, there are a number, alfalfa in rotation. Growing alfalfa for several years in rotation is often very beneficial. There are other interventions can help, such as the comb cut, such as using a wide blade, such as using interrow cultivation. I'm particularly interested in increasing seeding rates in areas with Canadian thistle, and cover crops have also been shown to help. Um, yeah, there's been a number of other research across the prairies. Again, I'm going to skip that just to finish up here. But the specific questions we're asking right now with this research is at what height should we fly the drone at to find the thistles? So we can obviously fly very low. The minimum height of drone flies at is 12 meters, and this will give us a very detailed image, but it's also very slow. It takes up a lot of battery power. The files you get are huge. And so the optimum would be is if we could fly as high as possible, which would go much more quickly, which would allow us to have less data stored and so on. And so we want to explore at which height do we get the optimum thistle mapping completed, and can we get away with these higher heights? And then the second main question is what time of the season can we see the thistle? So most of the research that does thistle mapping currently often looks at thistles pre-harvest, where most of the crop is dying out and brown, and the Canadian thistle will stay green at that time, which then distinguishes itself from the crop. But of course, farmers have different management techniques that they might want to deploy throughout the season. And so we're exploring whether we can see the thistle patches at different times of the season as well. And then this coming year, we're hoping to test variable seeding rates against the thistle patches to see if that's an effective technique. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into too many results here, but just to say that here's the difference between a 12-meter image of a Canadian thistle patch on a field in early June and 120 meters. And so here you can clearly see the thistles growing at 12 meters, and of course at 120 meters, not so much. Here's a very different example where this is from 120 meters now, and here we have very a very problematic outbreak of Canadian thistle across the field, and you can see they're actually quite apparent from 120 meters. So that is to say that the results of weed mapping will vary by field, by time, and by crop, and so on. And then I just want to finish up here discussing a couple other precision agroecology ideas. So mostly I've talked about seeding rates and weed mapping, but there's also an idea of precision conservation, which is this idea if you are able to consistently track low performing areas of a field, you can actually remove those from production, and that will actually save the money, the farmer money, and allow for natural biodiversity to exist in those places. And so there's been a few recent papers about that in terms of removing low performing patches and seeing increases in biodiversity, increases in net return, and actually even due to some edge effects in some spaces, increases in yield around the spaces around the patch that's been removed. Um, and then, yeah, there's a pile of other literature that gets into some of these ideas. The idea of digital twins, which essentially is a way of modeling your farm. So if you have a digital twin of your farm, the farmer can then imagine running different simulations to explore different outputs. There's this idea of pixel farming and how to design a robot, thinking about very small patch scale agriculture rather than large monocropping. But how can we actually design robots to farm on a very small scale? And then a paper that I would love to cite is one by Thomas Dahm from I think 2021, where he basically looks at different endpoints we might end up at if we use precision or robotic technologies in different ways. And so, here we've got this top utopian-like picture where we have all these little small robots managing lots of biodiversity, and then on the bottom you have, the dystopian version where you just have large robots working within the dominant monocrop paradigm, which, as some people have already pointed out, this might be where we are already. And so thinking about how we can maybe move to a system with more diversity in it and how robots might actually enable that. Okay, so just the key takeaways from the lecture today. Farming by variation is a nature-based solution as you're working with nature rather than against it. So whatever the natural variability is, you can work with that variability. Um, and digital technology allows a farmer to both see variation at a small scale and deploy inputs at that small scale. And this type of thinking, using precision agroecology, can be used in organic agriculture, it can be used in conservation, it can be used in simulation thinking, as well as this kind of next wave of thinking about pixel farming, which I have not gotten into today, but you're welcome to check out the papers on pixel farming, which we're going to discuss in our discussion class next week. And so we don't need to go into reading roles because this is just the lecture. But that is where I'll end the lecture for today. Thank you.